Good evening, and welcome to the 28th Annual Popcorn Forum at North Idaho College. I'm your host for this evening. I'm Mona Klinger. At this time, on behalf of all of us at North Idaho College, I would like to extend a sincere thank you to the Idaho Humanities Council for providing funding for our programs today and tomorrow. And in fact, we have been the recipients of these grants for the past 3 years, and we are very much appreciative of this. Let us give them a round of applause, please. I must say that having been in the presence of Dr. Clay Jenkinson all day and learning from him that the Idaho Council for the Humanities has to know that this has been money very well spent. This year, our journey through time has allowed us to visit 5 great cities of the world at pivotal points in their history. And all the time we ponder some important moral dilemma. This evening, welcome to Paris. We find ourselves in a restaurant in Paris, somewhere between the years of 1750 and 1800, and revolution is thick in the air. This morning, our great American president, Thomas Jefferson, met a contemporary, British author and feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft, and they shared their views of a utopian society and issues of the Enlightenment. And they are in our presence now. We are very pleased to have them with us. At 1 o'clock, Mr. Jefferson and Mrs. Wollstonecraft joined forces to debate Mahatma Gandhi on the moral dilemma of nonviolence versus revolution. And tonight, we will have conversations with some of the most colorful characters of French history. We invite you to hear our guests tell about their lives. Later, we will have a response from our esteemed guests. And then we do invite you, our audience members, to participate by asking questions of these most remarkable people. It gives me great pleasure, first of all, to introduce our panel in order of appearance. We have His Majesty, King Louis XVI of France. We have Her Majesty, Queen of France, Marie-Antoinette. We have Polish-born French scientist, Marie Curie. And I do regret to inform you, if you see your programs, that Napoleon Bonaparte will not be with us. There was something about meeting a Waterloo or something like that. And it has not been confirmed, I repeat, it has not been confirmed, but Swiss-born French journalist and radical politician, Jean-Paul Marat, who some say was very much responsible for the bloody atmosphere that led to the massacre of political prisoners in Paris. That's not been confirmed, but rumor has that he has been murdered today by a young aristocrat, Charlotte Corday, stabbed with a kitchen knife as he bathed in a tub in his salon. And we regret he will be unable to attend. So, welcome our guests today, along with me. We're so happy that you're here this evening. And it gives me great pleasure to announce His Majesty.
Parlez-vous français? Ah, c'est dommage. En anglais. I do not like Paris. I do not come to Paris. It is dirty. It is smelly. There are too many people. I would like to welcome you to my royal home, the Palace of Versailles. It has been the home of the French court for 100 years. It's also been the center of culture, the center of finance, the center of military campaigns. It is the center of all things that our France, the most powerful country in the world. As we walk through the hall and examine this palace, I will tell you you something about me and how we work.
Your Majesty?
Yes,
I do
you
believe you
can't hear
need
me.
the microphone.
Can I come
Perhaps
this
you may
way?
use that.
For the price of merely wearing a hat, you may enter my home. You may observe the routine of the royal court, and you may observe the coming and going of the royal family, such things as their getting dressed and their dining in the evening. As you've been told, I'm the King of France, Louis XVI, father of the people, emulator of Charlemagne. I was born in 1754, and at the age of 16, married the Austrian princess, Marie-Antoinette. This was a political marriage, arranged to establish a powerful alliance between our two countries. At the age of 20, I was crowned at Reims Cathedral. 18 years later, I was deposed and guillotined the following year in 1793 at the age of 39. But let's not dwell on this unpleasant future. Instead, let's go down to this way. I would like to take you into the Hall of Mirrors. It's one of my most favorite places. Excuse me, beautiful for reflecting. You really should have been here this morning. As the sun came through the windows and struck the mirrors and struck the chandeliers, it was absolutely gorgeous. No splendor could be explained. You must also realize that I was a second son and was never meant and never trained to be king of France. I much prefer the simple life, outdoor activities, working with my hands. I'm really a very good locksmith, and I have made many beautiful cabinets. Contrary to rumors, I'm really quite well read. I have one of the largest personal libraries in the nation. I also have a gift for mathematics, particularly statistics. I would have been very content to live this simple life, but instead I was forced into court as a result of my brother's unexpected death. Not only did I have to enjoy court life, but now I'm expected to lead one of the most rigid, complex, and flamboyant courts in the entire world. My great-grandfather built this splendid palace. You know him, Louis XIV, the splendid, flamboyant Sun King. He meant this to be the most magnificent palace in the world, to impress all countries who might come to this setting. My great-grandfather truly ruled France as a king. He was very interested in its prosperity. He wanted everything to be great. He aspired that he would be the greatest of all the great kings, even when compared to antique Rome. My grandfather, on the other hand, Louis XV, he was a spendthrift, loved luxury beyond all imagination. His court was extravagant, immoral, and absolutely carefree when it came to the welfare of the people of France. His 5 mistresses were almost as well known as he was. Unfortunately, I inherited his debt, the reputation of his court, and the unrest of financial hard times. I do not have a natural flamboyance for court that other times my family has enjoyed. It brought them power, it brought them respect, sometimes out of fear. I'm a good king. I have good intentions. They whisper, though, that I have no force behind my thoughts, that I have no will. My queen, on the other hand, has lots of force, but no way to make it shown. She is not very popular. With all of this in mind, then we have to look at what has been going on during these past years. I've actually been told by some people that I am the target of nasty rumors and political satire. But you must remember one thing. I am royal. You must remember that royalty has power. I am the absolute power in France. I am the absolute power for all temporal affairs. I have censorship over all publications in this country. I do have 5 councils who advise me. I have a council of state. I have a council of dispatches, a council of finance, a council of commerce, and a council of parties. Any council is free to take action on anything that they would like. But in the end, it comes back to me. I like to call these councils my bureaus. Novel thought. Government by bureaucracy. Clever. I like that. The door, my good man. Let's get that door open. It takes 15,000 individuals to keep this palace going in the way that's expected of the French court. It costs well over 30 million lire a year, 28 million just for retirement salaries. It's a lot of money. It looks good. Appearances are important. If governments want to be powerful, they have to look powerful. The cost is worth it. If we're going to have power, we've got to have palaces, we've got to have courts, we've got to have kings. Someone must pay the bills. I've got 3 estates in this country. I have the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. The commoners, they get to pick up the tab for all of this. The nobility and the clergy, because of their position, they don't pay taxes. Some people think that's somewhat unfair. But I've also noticed lately that this 3rd estate, the commoners, they're doing quite well. France is blessed with very fertile lands, with great and diversified climate, a relatively flourishing commerce, and the wealth of some of these commoners is actually exceeding the wealth of some of our old noble families. In fact, some of our noble princes have been rumored to be manuring their pockets by marrying the daughters of these rich commoners. In short, priests will pray, nobles, they may fight, and the commoners pay for all. Do keep in mind, I'm the most powerful king in Europe. I do not have gold mines like the King of Spain, but I have more wealth than he, because my subjects are inexhaustible, and his mines will run out someday. There are those Americans, and there are some Frenchmen, who are talking liberty and equality for all. Equality. This is a political ideal. It cannot be true equality. How can everybody be equal? That's not so. Liberty, freedom from external control, a government with restricted powers. This can't be, and it surely can't last very long. I've been reading about some of these ideals from my library, and how can they say that originally man was perfect and that the ruled and the ruler will establish a government together? That these people are going to work at what I can do? I don't think so. But I have asked my court to read some of these writings. I've also asked them to study the Greek ideals on good government. Then I had a brainstorm. I said, you really ought to know what the commoners are doing. Why don't you dress up like shepherds and shepherdesses? Find out what the simple folk are really like. It was a good idea. The court now spends hours dressed up down at our dairy hamlet, and they think it is marvelous doing the mundane tasks that it keeps to make a dairy work. However, they have made one request of our treasury. the milk pails must come from Sèvres. I don't understand how equality and liberty can really replace prosperity. I mean, bread is cheaper today in Paris than it is in London. There's cheese and milk available. Wine is still considered to be a luxury, but they have it twice a week on their tables. Meat's available on holidays. Their houses, well, they appear sort of crude. But people tell me this is done on purpose so they will not attract my tax collectors. There's leather for shoes on Sunday. There are wooden shoes for work days. Clothing seems adequate and seems to copy that of the royal court. Surely prosperity is much better than liberty and equality. People who want to bring forth change always have the idea to exaggerate those things that they think are wrong. I'm not sure this is absolutely true. I do live in isolation here at Versailles by choice. Again, I do not like to go to Paris. I have not been there for years. Rumor has it that Marie visits there on occasion. Not me. I will not go until I am forced. I think I hear someone. Excuse me. Entrez-vous. Entrez-vous. Yes. Oh, excuse me. The courier has something for me here. 3 messages, he says. This one asked me to call a meeting of the Estates General. This one's not met in over 200 years. It says the commoners are talking that they want to declare France a republic, adopt a constitution, and possibly establish a limited monarchy. I don't think so. What else have we got here? Oh, this one's from Catherine, Tsarina of all Russia. I really like her closing. Remember, kings ought to pursue their career undisturbed by the cries of the people, just as the moon pursues her course unimpeded by howling dogs. I'll save this one. Good ideas. This one's a little rumpled and a little wet. The courier told me it was tied to a rock that was tossed through a window in my sister's apartment. Despotism will die. Liberty will triumph. We will have no more nobles, no more priests, only equality and liberty for all. These are serious statements. I know I have not done possibly the best, but I also know I've had very good intentions. I think I've hit a point in my life where I have possibly no control. I inherited something beyond what I could grasp. The simple life would have been better. I would have really enjoyed it. When you stop and think, managing 15,000 people to keep your life running, 600 people to keep you dressed. I don't know. With your permission, I would like to retire back to my apartment to be with my wife, my 2 children, and my sister. I'll leave this for you to consider. Prosperity, liberty, equality for all, a choice in things. I don't think you're ready for it. I think we can still do better for you.
And now Her Majesty, the Queen, Marie-Antoinette.
Bonjour. I am Queen Marie-Antoinette, born to Francis I and Maria Theresa of Austria in November of 1755. Approximately 1 year later, my mother had this brilliant idea to get together with Louis XV and arrange my marriage to the then Dauphin, Louis XVI. I was brought up in a home that was very, very lenient at worst and frivolous at best. I was allowed to run and play as I might and was not terribly educated in the manner that would befit the future Queen of France. I was, more apt to say, a little on the spoiled side. However, this did not become a problem until later on when I got married. In 1770, at the age of 14 and a half, I was sent to France to get married. At the age of 15, the marriage took place, and I found myself in court as the future Queen of France. Court at that time consisted of mostly a life in the very public eye, as was mentioned by my husband. Everything that we did was watched. Everything that we said was heard. They were allowed to see us dress, for heaven's sakes. Louis and I, unfortunately, did not have any children for quite some time. Louis was impotent for a while in early life, and there were nasty rumors that the reason that I didn't have any children was because I didn't want to be a mother. I wasn't cut from that tapestry that was going to be of good parentage. Needless to say, growing up in court with little education to teach me how to be a proper queen, I was foolish and childish and far too trustworthy of many people in court that I had no business speaking my mind to. And unfortunately, my reputation was on the way to ruin at a very young age. In 1755, Louis was made King of France. At that point, court as we knew it was starting to cease and desist. I had decided I had had enough of public life and didn't want to share my everyday coming and goings with the common people. So I made a place called the Le Petit Trianon. It was kind of my very own personal playground, if you will. At the Petit Trianon, there were theater performances and operas, gambling until the wee hours of the morning, lots of singing and dancing, things that the common people of France just didn't understand, but paid for. Finally, a few years after that, Louis and I managed to have children. We had 4. Unfortunately, 2 of them died at an early age. Having children managed to bring me down to earth a little bit more, and it made me, a little bit more wary of the singing and dancing of my early days, and made me more of a mother figure. Unfortunately, the common people of France wouldn't let my early party girl days go, and they consistently thought of me as the ruin of all of France. In 1785, what was known as the diamond necklace scandal broke. There was a necklace made of numerous diamonds that was made from jewelers for King Louis XV, for his mistress, Madame du Barry. Unfortunately, Louis passed away before he could purchase this necklace, and the jewelers, unsure of what to do with it, had brought it to my attention to be purchased. Now, at that point, France was in no condition to acquire a necklace of such splendor. So, unfortunately, I had to refuse them. Well, unbeknownst to me, a thief and a priest decided that they would get together and purchase this necklace in my honor and supposedly at my request. Well, when payment time came around and the jewelers did not receive their payment, they became a little suspicious and they brought it to my attention. What diamond necklace? I hadn't seen a diamond necklace. I don't own the diamond necklace. Oh, misery was to come upon us. It came to court, and the thief was found guilty of stealing in name of the Queen. The priest was questioned at length, but found not guilty in his actions to go along with the thief with the diamond necklace. The Queen, although found not guilty, was slandered so very much that in the end, She might as well have been claimed to be guilty, because, as you know, the propaganda that went around claimed that I was the ruin of all of France. I had to have had something to do with the necklace, even though I hadn't. At the end of 1785, every natural and national disaster that came upon France was in the end my fault. The monarchy, the nobility, and the noblemen were all separating in their classes. A rift was becoming very apparent. And in 1788, France hit its lowest financial stage yet. This led in 1789 to the formation of the National Assembly. Alas, the revolution was beginning. In that year alone, 5,000 women marched from Paris to Versailles. Not only did they want our heads on a stick, they also wanted lower prices for bread in Paris, and they wanted the return of the monarchy to Paris so they could keep an eye on us. Unfortunately, we didn't have much choice, and the family picked up and moved to Tuileries, where we lived as very watched people. We continued on at Tuileries for a couple of years until it became very apparent that the revolution was moving at a very fast speed, and it was no longer safe for Louis and myself and our family to continue to live there. So we made plans for escape. We were going to escape by carriage to Varennes. Unfortunately, the plan was not as successful as we had hoped. We had numerous carriages which were filled with lots of trunks of things that we needed to continue our new lives, and many too many people, which made us slow in our departure. And we were caught and forced rather rudely to go back to Tuileries, where we lived no longer free and were treated very poorly at best. Louis was then forced to accept the new constitution from the National Assembly. War was declared on Austria, my homeland, in 1792. And we continued to live at Tuileries. Unfortunately, that same year, Tuileries was stormed, and we only very managed to escape with our lives, where we were to find shelter in the Legislative Assembly building. Unfortunately, on our way out, Louis forgot, or perhaps didn't think, to tell the 900 Swiss guards that were guarding the Tuileries to stand down in attempt of people coming in to take over. As a result, 600 Swiss guards were massacred that day. Ah, revolution. As we moved from the Legislative Assembly, they moved us to the Temple Towers, where our monarchy positions were completely suspended. In September of that same year of 92, the September massacres in the prisons transpired. The monarchy was no more. And in the massacres of the prisons, the nobility and anyone who had any sympathies at all for the monarchy were executed. Ah, revolution. The trial of Louis XVI commenced in 1792, and in early of 93, Louis was led to his execution. However, being royalty that he was led in a carriage with free hands and given dignity until his very last breath. Unfortunately, we were all moved to one room in the tower, and we led very poor lives, the rest of us. And in 1793, I was moved to La Carnegie prison, where I was to spend the rest of my days. Many attempts were made to rescue me. However, they were unsuccessful. In October 14th of 1793, I was brought to trial on crimes against the state and against nature. On the late night of October 15th, the trial ended after 2 days of torturous testimony. Early morning, 4 a.m., October 16th, the verdict was commenced. Guilty. Death by execution. At 5 a.m. on October 16th, I was led, not treated like royalty, mind you, but as a mere commoner, with my hands bound on a regular common cart into the center of the Palais de Révolution, where I was to be executed by guillotine. Ah, revolution. Ask me, do I support revolution? No. Revolution took everything from me. It took my favorite way of life. It took my husband. It took my family. It took my country. Ah, revolution.
We'd now hear from Madame Marie Curie.
Bonsoir. Je m'appelle Madame Marie Curie. Je suis une scientiste et j'ai découvert la radioactivité. You will pardon me if I do not rise, as with my 2 previous trips to your country, I find myself a bit tired and weak. Those who come after me and work with atomic materials may perhaps be able to verify the effects of radium on the body. You might be able to see the burns on my coat. I find my hands somewhat irritated as well. I'm honored to be on the platform with these illustrious figures from my past. I am somewhat out of my time, and I would have to say that had I lived during these times, I probably wouldn't have had much contact with any of them. For one thing, I was from a poor family in Poland, and for another thing, I was never very much interested in politics. I lived a life of pure science, disinterested science, the pursuit of knowledge. Before I go on, I would also say that I am not much of a speaker. Most find me rather shy and distant, but I must speak to advance the cause of science. In my time, I became, somewhat to my dismay, the first internationally prominent scientist. The fact that I was a woman made it especially interesting. Not to me. I did not consider myself a feminist. I made my way on my own terms, made my own independence, led my own life. My scientific discoveries took place during a time of great discovery by many great minds. Though some perhaps have forgotten, my discovery of the radioactive properties of certain elements was the first in a line that led directly to your atomic age. My discoveries, for which I would earn 2 Nobel Prizes, came before a young patent clerk named Albert Einstein published his paper on the special theory of relativity, before Ernest Rutherford and Niels Bohr described what you know as the structure of the atom. I'm uncomfortable speaking about myself, but there has been so much attention in the press, some of it somewhat unfavorable, some of it romanticized, that I must clarify my role in history at least a little. Interested in science. My father was a professor of physics. And so, because the Russian police would not let us study, we met in secret in something we called the floating university, because it met first here, then there. And we had a secret laboratory where we performed experiments. My older sister Branya and I came to an agreement that she would go to Paris, to the Sorbonne, the great university there, and study medicine. I would send her my earnings as a tutor and governess. And then when she had completed her studies, I too would go to Paris, and she would help support me while I studied. We did this, and I spent long cold hours in my 6th floor apartment with no heat, living on bread and butter and perhaps some tea while I studied and studied and studied. In 1893, I went to sit for my exam for my master's in physics, and those of you who are students may perhaps appreciate my feeling of panic when I looked at the first question and my mind went blank. I sat there frozen for a moment, feeling some terror that perhaps all my effort was to come to nothing. And then I began to write. And when they announced the results of the exam, I had graduated first in my class again. This earned me a scholarship so that I was able to return after a trip home to Poland and continue my studies. It was at about this time that I met a young scientist named Pierre Curie. And we struck up an acquaintance, both of us being very interested in pure science, the kind of science exemplified by Louis Pasteur and others. We married in 1895. He was working at the Sorbonne in the School of Physics as the chief of the laboratory. I worked with him, and I pursued a job teaching in order to earn money so that I too could study and work in the lab. It was in 1898, in January, that I read an article about a mysterious discovery of something that the discoverers had called X-rays because they knew nothing about the origin of these rays. And I decided this would be a worthwhile topic for my own studies to pursue my doctoral degree. Bear in mind that at this time, no woman held a doctoral degree, but that didn't really matter to me. My interest was in science. I began my studies and my research with uranium, which seemed to emanate these mysterious rays. And after several months of very careful, meticulous experimentation, notation on every step that I took, I could report that these rays were not affected by light, they were not affected by heat nor cold. That I was quite sure of. My small storeroom I worked in was quite cold. Sometimes I was working in temperatures of 6 degrees above 0 Celsius, so cold was definitely a factor in my experiments. There was not a chemical reaction taking place. It didn't matter whether I added water or other substances, powdered the uranium or left it whole, there were still these X-rays. And so I made my first, what I think would be called breakthrough, my first hypothesis that was truly significant for the scientific age that was dawning. I conjectured that this action, these rays, were a property of the atom itself. And I coined the term radioactivity to describe these rays. Now, in order to explain where these rays were coming from, I was testing quantities of uranium and discovered that I was measuring more X-rays than could be accounted for by the uranium I had. And my next hypothesis that would be considered significant was I believed that there might be another unknown element present. Pierre thought my studies were so interesting and worthwhile that he left his own work and joined my efforts. And after 45 months of painstaking extraction and experimentation, I held in my hand the first salts of radium, this new element we had named. It was for this that we would receive the Nobel Prize in 1903. My daughter Eve, the second of my 2 children, was born the next year. Now I had Irene and Eve, and a life of science with my dear Pierre as my partner. But 2 years later, he would be killed in the streets of Paris, run down by a truck drawn by 2 horses. I had to go on alone, working as the first woman to be professor of physics at the Sorbonne. I stepped into Pierre's role there, the only one in the world qualified to teach a class on radioactivity. After all, I was the discoverer of this property. I worked with my research assistants, continuing my experiments, and in 1911 won another Nobel Prize, this one in chemistry. It was my dream to have a laboratory where we could continue the researches into the various applications of radioactivity. One of the applications that was interesting to some was its use in medicine. And indeed, we thought that perhaps we had found a cure for cancer because you could use radium to burn diseased skin off of someone, off of animals or people. This is part of the reason that my fame spread. I was believed to be the discoverer of the cure for cancer. Radiotherapy used for the treatment of cancer in France was called Curie therapy. This was also the dawning of the age of mass journalism, which you take for granted now, but in my day, scientists did not routinely become celebrities. The story of Pierre and I, our brief marriage, his tragic death, all of this seemed to seize the imagination, along with the magical words cancer cure. That guaranteed my fame. I was able to establish my Radium Institute. We worked hard to gain philanthropic contributions and the efforts of the Sorbonne to get it established, and we were all set to open it in 1914. Now, for some of you, that may ring a bell. That would be when the Germans invaded France. I know some of the other speakers on the stage will speak of pacifism and revolution. I was on the battlefield. We took my advances with the uses of radium and my knowledge of X-rays, and I assembled the equipment and the vehicles necessary to put ambulances onto a battlefield for the first time, because I recognized, unlike some of my fellow scientists, that this would be a long war, and a war different than others that had been fought because of the technology being used. So we outfitted ambulances, they called them the little Curies, and took them onto the battlefield so that for the first time a doctor could look at an X-ray and know where the bullets and shrapnel were, where the broken bones were. My daughter, Irene, who was studying nursing, went with me as my assistant. And in the last year of that war alone, over 1 million men and boys went through our ambulances on the battlefield and in the hospitals where I had established them. It was a terrible time. I was making some notes in the margins of my autobiography. I will be asked to publish this later. And I made some comments about the war. I don't speak often about it, but I would read to you what I had to say at that time. I never could forget the terrible impression of all that destruction of human life and health. To hate the very idea of war, it ought to be sufficient to see once what I have seen so many times. All over those years, men and boys brought to the advanced ambulance in a mixture of mud and blood, many of them dying of their injuries, and many others recovering but slowly in the space of months with pain and suffering. After the war, I just wished to continue with my science, but France was poor from the expenses of the war, and the cost of science was going up. I was the discoverer of radium. I was the one who had developed the process that allowed us to purify radium and use it for so many wonderful things. But Pierre and I had always thought it would be wrong to profit personally from our science. So we did not license the process, we gave it away freely. I did not own any radium. The radium that was used at the Institute belonged to the Institute. And its cost was going up as more and more people took an interest in this new science. I was helped by a woman from your country. She was the editor of a magazine, and she was interested in meeting people she considered famous and important, and came to visit me in Paris. For some reason, she took a liking to me, and I don't have many friends, and she asked if there were anything she could do to help me. And I said I would like to have a gram of radium that I could call my own. So she started a fundraising drive in America. I estimated the cost at the time to be 1 million francs. In just a few short months, your generous countrymen and countrywomen gave the money that it took to buy my gram of radium. And I came to the United States and received it at the Oval Office from your president, Warren G. Harding. But I was tired. As I have said, I often grow tired, and had to cut our trip short. I continued to work to operate the Institute, to travel and speak on behalf of science, to raise the necessary money to buy instruments and supplies so that we would have the premier laboratory doing research in this important area. My daughter Irene, at my side as my assistant, we made many advances, I felt, although some later would describe some of my work as less than original. In 1925, Irene earned her doctorate, and then she married my assistant at the lab, Frederick Joliot, and they were a couple much like Pierre and myself had been, eager and brilliant. I was not to know before I died that they would go on and earn a Nobel Prize for themselves as a couple, just as Pierre and I had done. All my life, I felt that I had suffered from one small malady and another, and I had worried about my health, but I refused to accept that radium might be having an effect on my body, even though the evidence was growing. And indeed, on July 4th, 1934, after a long life, for someone who had worked with radium, a very long life, I was 66, after many important discoveries and much recognition, after being part of the dawn of your atomic age along with many other great minds, I would die.
Yes, now. Thank you very much. I would like to invite our esteemed guests to make a response to some of the presentations from our guests from France. Mr. Gandhi, do you have anything you'd like to tell them or respond to?
Yes, yes, indeed, I would. I share with the King and the Queen that their revolution was not necessary at all. I think it is indeed sad, but not for the reason you would hope. Because indeed, you had to be removed from office. There is no reason for one man to have meat on his table and another to not. And for some to have shoes, as you say, of leather on Sundays and wood during the week. In my country, a very poor country, in India, we too had a problem. We had the British, 100,000 British controlling us. There were 300 million Indians. They could have revolted and killed the British, as your people revolted and killed you. But what we did peaceably. We got rid of the British. And I say it could have happened in your country. Yes, you too would be gone. And there would be both liberty, quality, and fraternity, as was the symbol of your revolution. But it could have been done peaceably by nonviolent actions. All they had to do was to stop paying for your folly. Had they all done that, bravely, each man and each woman, you would have left more peaceably and perhaps lived somewhere else.
Mrs. Wollstonecraft?
Yes, thank you. I think it is abundantly clear, having heard from the royalty here, why the mere commoners of France rose up in rebellion against these tyrannical people. The ostentation, the waste, the frivolity, the arrogance of these two is abundantly clear from their comments. The arrogance to believe that dressing up like shepherds and shepherdesses and playing at that particular profession would give them any notion of what the cruel life of the shepherds and shepherdesses was like indicates what I've always thought of the French, that they are so enamored of the stage because it presents unto the public the sort of frivolity and shallowness of their lives. These people lived a life of fantasy. The notion that their lives were taken from them, that they, or at least Marie, lost everything, is ludicrous when one considers what was gained through the French Revolution and the equality and dreams that were fulfilled eventually from that rebellion. My commendations go to Madame Curie. I've always believed that the progress of any nation is in direct proportion to its advances in science, and I commend you for your efforts. I also commend her for her independence. For me, independence has always been the joy and guiding principle of my life, and like Marie, I would be willing to live on a barren plateau and to give up my needs in order to have that independence, so I commend her for that. I commend her also for her generosity of spirit, along with her husband, to work not for personal gain, but to be of use to a nation, to advance that nation through their efforts, and to see, finally, proof positive that my ideas about the role that education would play in the independence, growth, and usefulness of a woman, she is a living human to prove to you the correctness of my vision.
Would you contrast that particular view with the education of Marie-Antoinette, perhaps?
Her behavior was so puerile as to defy and not be worthy of comment.
And Mr. Jefferson?
Well, I had meant to address the King and Queen with insult, vituperation, and ad hominem, but I see Mrs. Wollstonecraft has already taken care of that. So I will instead say that I once wrote to George Washington, if you took all of the crowned heads of Europe, every one of them, and molded them into one single individual, he would not deserve to be elected vestryman of the merest parish church in Virginia. One time I had a dinner party in New York when I was the Secretary of State, and John Adams came, the Vice President, and Alexander Hamilton came, the Secretary of the Treasury. And after the tablecloth had been removed, a political discussion ensued, and John Adams said, if you could correct the corruptions of the British Constitution, it would be the finest on earth. Alexander Hamilton said, no. If you took the corruptions of the English Constitution out of it, it would no longer have any usefulness, because its very corruptions are what enable it to take a handle on human weaknesses and human passions and human lust. It's the corruptions themselves which make for the success of that Constitution. John Adams then said that he would accept the American Constitution, but he actually thought the best possible Constitution for the United States would be a constitutional monarchy of the sort that Britain had devised. Hamilton, as usual, was more extreme. He said no. He would accept a constitutional monarchy, but the best form of government is a hereditary monarchy, because then there's no messy business of succession. We always know who the next king will be, and there's no contest between factions. Well, normally I kept quiet in such disagreeable discussions, but now I found I could not. And so I said, Mr. Hamilton, it's a very ingenious idea, hereditary monarchy. Perhaps first we should try a chair of hereditary mathematics at one of our universities. And if that succeeds, then we will move on to monarchy. I bore the king and queen no ill will. I said, in fact, of the king, honest, well-meaning, and usually drunk. I will say this, if either of you had shown the slightest good sense during the crisis, the French Revolution would certainly have ended in a constitutional monarchy. It is only your own folly which led to the extremities which cost you your lives. Who would spend a moment thinking about monarchy when you can instead address science? I said the greatest service a man can do for his country is to introduce a new plant species into its midst. But that was nothing compared to Dean Swift, the great Irish satirist, who said, he who makes two blades of grass grow where one did hitherto has done more good than all of the statesmen of history. I did not wish to be the president. I did not wish to be a politician. On the eve of my departure from the presidency in 1809, I wrote to my old friend DuPont, a Frenchman, and said, nature fitted me to be a scientist by rendering that my supreme delight. Only the emergencies of the times in which I have lived have turned me from my delight, which is science and letters, to my duty, which is the disagreeable burden of politics. I only have one quibble with Madame Curie. You claim to be the first scientist of international renown. That was the only unhumble thing that you said. I must correct you. Two people, Alexander von Humboldt, the great Prussian who came to the United States in 1804, the first serious geographer in Central and South America, the first serious geographer of Cuba. He stayed with me in the White House for a short time, and he was internationally famous long before your time. But as a patriot, I must insist on the greatest international scientist, Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin was a Renaissance man, the only man I looked up to with reverence in my life. I considered him the greatest man of the 18th century on either side of the Atlantic. And just to tie it back to our crowned heads, I remember Turgot's quip that Franklin snatched lightning from the skies and the scepters from kings.
We'd very much like to invite our members of the audience to come forward and ask questions. We have a mic right here because our participants are eager to respond to your questions. Come right on up.
There must be a student out there.
Thank you.
My question is for His Majesty. Your Majesty, with all due respect to the Queen, Why didn't you do something to help your starving people? Surely you and your advisors realized the political implications when the Queen proposed to let the starving masses eat cake instead of cheaper bread they hungered for.
Marie did not make that statement. My great-grandmother made that statement 18 years before Marie was born. The statement was, if they were without bread, it's too bad they did not like pastries. This was long before we arrived on the scene. At the terms of people being hungry during our time, we would not have known it. There were no newspapers. There were no reports. We did not leave. We did not go to Paris. We were involved at Versailles. We had our own time. It was probably the only time in history where leisure time weighed on people's hands. We had to think of things to do when it takes 2 hours to dress and 24 people to dress you as you stand nude, and people argue over who should hand you your first garment. And if someone of the next rank came in, they got the garment to hand. There are more than one accounts of Marie standing nude in her dressing room, waiting to be dressed. We had no idea what the people were doing, and we weren't educated to care. We had what we needed until we lost our heads.
Now, Your Majesty, you said there were no newspapers at the time, but I do recall reading that one of the reasons why Marie-Antoinette was so out of favor with the people was because of the proliferation of pamphlets and rags that went out and continued to, make claims about her that she claimed was not true.
These were underground things, some published in other countries in Europe, some published in Paris, and with I would say, I guess, a byline of another country. But we really didn't get involved, even though people came through our house all the time. We didn't go see what was going on. That was not part of our life. We received very poor background. We were truly a hereditary position. That was it. That's all we had to do, is be in the right birth order at the right time, and you got it all.
Would you like to respond to?
I
what
just
His
once
Majesty
again
said?
say that there is a perfect argument against primogeniture, to have such ignorant people inheriting ignorance generation after generation after generation.
But you don't have to be educated to get what you want. You got it.
I must intrude to comment on just one thing. I, in my lifetime, would have held that the greatness of a nation was measured by the amount of its budget that it dedicated to national education.
There were country schools. That was part of our downfall. Whenever you educate the middle class and the lower class, your government will fall.
Exactly my point.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Mr. Jefferson, do you have any other comments for? You have nothing good to say to our monarchy? Do they have nothing of value in their lives?
Well, I don't know how hard it would have been to have seen the misery of the people. Voltaire, whose work you surely knew, said in France every man is either the hammer or the anvil. Lafayette, you surely knew the misery of the country and attempted moderately to find a middle ground between the extremists and your own absolutism. It didn't take intelligence to see the misery of the people. It just took eyes, and both of you, I believe, have them.
You tend to see what you would like.
And we rarely, if ever, left the palace. I was very, very busy playing at the Le Petit Trianon and then was a mother. I didn't have time to worry about everyone else.
And I like to go to the blacksmith shop and make locks.
Exactly.
However, Your Majesty, I remember reading stories about you where for a time you would go down into the city and dress in rags so you could get the pulse of the people. So are you contradicting yourself here?
I would go to the city on occasion, but certainly not for learned reasons.
Sir, do you have a question? Thank you.
It seems that everyone here understands the traditions of power. And it seems today in our society we need to share some of that power with the individual families by introducing some concept of family tradition around the issues of sex, money, and God. As leaders of your time, what would you propose would be respectable leadership of today in our society to help the core family take the power that they need to teach significant traditions around the issues of sex, money, and God in terms of spirituality, self-respect, mutual respect, and participation in their own society? What can the powers to be do to help bring that about?
I'll gladly answer that. The government has absolutely no role in this, sir. This is your province. Government delivers the mail.
You are the powers that be.
Mr. Gandhi?
As far as the sex is concerned, I profess that sex should be kept to a bare minimum. There should be 2 to 3 children in each family, no more. And when you have that, the intimacy should be ended. And I personally, in my life, and I died in my 80s, I didn't have sex after my last son, and I was the better for it, I might add. And frankly, I developed a greater love for my wife because of it. We didn't get that other stuff in the way.
Mr. Jefferson, sir, would you repeat your response to my question, please?
My point is simply this, that you cannot look to leadership, not in the priesthood, not in government, and not in any other entity for what you are calling family integrity and family values. This is a profoundly private matter. We come together as individuals, as families, as communities for certain exceedingly limited purposes: to deliver the mail, to protect our coasts and harbors, to settle interstate disputes, to adopt a common currency, to have a foreign policy. We do not come together as a community to abdicate our own private values to the state, and certainly not to the priesthood. So this is a private matter, and government at every level has absolutely no business intruding itself upon your privacy. Moreover, you should not look to leadership anywhere but in your own soul, in your own conscience on these questions. That's the very basis of liberty, that you are sovereign unto yourself, but you have come together with the rest of us for those things that we can share. But the community is profoundly not a moral exemplar, nor should it attempt to intrude itself in that way.
Mr. Jefferson, Mr. President, I must suggest that you're absolutely correct. Look at what happened in India. We threw out the British government from controlling us without any material violence from us to them. And then, about the same time, when the Hindu and the Muslim argued, and with strictly religious-based arguments, politically based, woven in with religious thread, 500,000 people died. It was unnecessary. Had the religious issue been kept out of it and been kept in the home, with each family making their own individual decisions, 500,000 people would not have died. That, sir, is a lot of people.
I'd like to suggest that the government and the religious institution for many, many centuries doesn't mind having the power over the mind or the pocket of the individual or the family. But I hesitate to see in history much effort put out by either institution to educate the individual and the family to think for themselves, to educate the family to a higher level of understanding and responsibility and commitment and involvement. And you have indicated yourselves here today that politics are corrupt. Politics are probably corrupt because of the money and the economy and the capitalism. And if you have the courage and the intelligence to control your generations and the following generations behind you, what is your personal calling spiritually to provide information that's common to all human beings through the God-given instincts, intuitions, and intelligence, that they can elevate themselves, as this lady has pointed out, that education is a key factor to rights and to liberties. And you and I know very well that many of the people today that are struggling with these issues of liberties and rights and freedoms are because they don't have a common source of intelligent information, which obviously you folks had access to by your own study and by those that were your advisors. And the challenge today seems to be still to educate the individual and the family, not to the labels, not to your philosophies and theologies, not to your politics, but to their own understanding of common human wisdom. And by doing that, as Mr. Jefferson pointed out this morning, or earlier this afternoon, why didn't you free your slaves? Some of them didn't want to, some of them did, but when you teach them to read and write and think for themselves, they don't want to be slaves.
Thank you very much. Would you like to respond to that last part of the question then?
I won't respond to the issue of slavery. It's clear that anyone who has had a chance to read the work of John Locke or the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France or any number of texts of this sort will never be content until he realizes his freedom. Late in life, I said to John Adams, the fact of the book means that liberty is on the rise and despotism is on the wane, because now that presses are relatively inexpensive and efficient, books can be proliferated, and books are small, inexpensive, and smuggleable, and therefore they can be taken into all the despotic regimes on earth, and they will invariably liberate those regimes. So I'm a believer in the notion that the flame of liberty will engulf the world. No question about that. The point of your statement, however, is who will provide the leadership, the moral, spiritual leadership for humankind. That has chiefly been the province of priests. May I say I think they've done a very poor job of it, but it is decidedly, in my opinion, not the province of government.
Is it possible, or is it time in history when the powers should engage in a marriage, that the power between the church and the state should engage in marriage instead of keeping it divided? And the political reason for that, I think all of us are aware of centuries ago.
It didn't work well in my lifetime, and I doubt that it will work well in yours, sir.
Well, if democracy has worked better than a lot of other governments, maybe it's time to try a new philosophy combining government and religion.
What I'd like to do now, thank you very much for your questions, is to kind of break character. We have on this side of our panel people who are performing for the first time this evening. And what I'd like them to do is perhaps tell us a little bit about what they discovered about their characters, things that maybe bothered you as you were talking in front of our group this evening. Perhaps we'll start with you, Mr. Murray.
I found it was true that history repeats itself. As I was trying to find out considerable information about Louis XVI, I felt very much like John F. Kennedy. I was the person who accompanied Marie to Paris, to Versailles. There is tons of stuff written on Marie, and you have to dig through Marie's stuff to find out what it was I was doing. I also got a little bit afraid as I was reading about the revolution. The fact that as two figureheads of power, we had absolutely no private life whatsoever. We were constantly on display. To be observed dressing, dining, everything else. And I sort of thought, sort of like the White House, sort of like politics today. A few people of the upper middle class in France led the revolution, and a lot of people who were quote-unquote ignorant followed, and that made me a little bit scared. Would that be happening today? The revolution wouldn't be of the same magnitude, but are we just following people who are making noise and following more or less in the gutter of what's happening and thinking that's the leadership of today?
And if you have any questions about this part of the program, please feel free to come forward and ask those questions also. Was there anything in the lifestyle that you saw that you would admire or be jealous of, or?
Oh, I would love to live at Versailles. No doubt about it. 15,000 servants, that's a bit much. I felt sorry for them that they couldn't even plan their own escape. The carriage they chose was about the size of a fifth-wheeler, being pulled by 16 horses. It had to attract attention as it meandered to the countryside. And it did.
Bright yellow, I believe.
Bright yellow, yes. I mean, it had to be very complete with silver potties and the whole works. The only thing they forgot about was to bring food. They brought lots of clothes, silver utensils for eating, all this kind of stuff, but they had no idea. They could have just easily gotten on a horse and ridden out of the country. But that didn't ever cross their minds. They had to do it in style.
Holly Hetrick has played Marie-Antoinette. Would you share with us some things you learned? And
Terror. I was complimented by Tony into doing this. I was a student of his last semester, and we role-played in class quite a bit, and he would compliment me on my abilities in class, and then spring, oh, well, why don't you do the popcorn for him? You're so very good at this. So I was kind of complimented into it. In choosing Marie-Antoinette, I found that we'd spoken earlier about the let them eat cake quote. Everyone, as I said, oh, I'm going to portray Marie-Antoinette, would say to me, oh, well, let's hear you say it. Let them eat cake. Are you happy? And, oh, absolutely. And then when I researched a little bit more and I found out that she actually hadn't said, let them eat cake. Oh, then I had some fun. I thought that was very good. I also found that as kind of vile as a creature Marie-Antoinette was in her early years and in her younger days, it was due to, in my opinion, a great lack of education. She just didn't know any better for so many years, and then it was too late. You can only take your reputation so far, as I'm sure many people know, and once you've lived your life and you've become what you've become, it's hard to change that, and especially in the public's mind. So I felt kind of sorry for her at the end. She had a lot of misery imposed on her in the prison that she spent the last few years of her life in. She wasn't allowed to even do things on a daily basis that you and I take for granted in privacy. Going to the bathroom was done in public. Things to this nature that, in my opinion, no human should ever have to go through. She was put through on a daily basis. And no matter how ignorant or how evil she had been, I don't feel that any human should have to go through that. I thought that was very wrong.
any questions of Marie-Antoinette?
Just one. You know that wonderful story. I'm very proud of my students, and Holly is a good example. Holly, when you were doing the TV show, tell them about that. There were some things, obviously, that you did that were very responsible for your demise, but also there was some conspiracy to blame you for things that helped the revolution that you didn't do. Tell them the story of the diamond.
The diamond necklace. I alluded to that earlier a little bit, and that was in the, there were a couple of people in France, along with a priest in France, who had transpired to purchase the diamond necklace. And unfortunately, Marie was in the wrong place at the wrong time, so to speak, in that she had seen the necklace. She had wanted the necklace, but they couldn't afford the necklace. So these people transpired to purchase the necklace in the name of Marie-Antoinette, with the priest posing as the buyer and ending up putting up some amount of money for it as a down payment. Well, when the time came and he couldn't make the second and the third payment, the jewelers then came to the Queen and said, you know, where is our money? You have the necklace. Well, the Queen was dumbfounded. She had no idea that anyone had purchased this necklace in her name and was spreading it all through the countryside that she had the necklace, promising that she would wear the necklace at court the next they saw her, or at the opera the next time she went out. And of course, the Queen never did wear the necklace because she didn't have it. All of this came to trial, and while Marie-Antoinette was not found guilty, just the mere idea that she had seen the necklace and had she had the money, she would have purchased it, made her guilty of wanting it, and that was enough to make her reputation all the more poor, I suppose.
Mrs. Wollstonecraft, don't you find a lot of what Marie-Antoinette is saying about herself fairly sanitized, the version that she seems like such a victim? I was watching you respond to some of the things that she was saying about herself, how you know, it's, oh, poor me. Do you have any opinions about?
I just find it remarkable that she could pretend to such ignorance and to be so self-centered and so much in denial, I think you would say in modern terms, about her own behavior, her own selfishness, her own, well, I'm going to be ad hominem again, her own lack of purity and cleanliness, along with Louis' lack of purity and cleanliness. I mean, imagine sleeping with this man who never bathed. And this lack of ignorance, this ignorance because of lack of education, I do concede that would have been a major problem for her. But to be so self-centered, even as she grew older, to have no awareness of the misery of the people and to be uncaring about them is, well, it's proof of my feelings about the aristocracy, that actually all my writings about education dealt primarily with middle-class women, because women of her ilk were just beyond help, beyond redemption.
Barbara Chamberlain is a member of our Board of Trustees.
I think one of the things that I was pleased to discover as a young girl, I read a biography of Marie Curie, and it was a very romantic portrayal, and I sort of fell in love with her. And one of the neat discoveries for me was to learn that her birthday is a day after mine, and that she had 2 daughters, and the older one had blonde hair, and the younger one had dark hair, and that's what I've got. They're here. So there were a few parallels that were sort of a personal pleasure. I think she probably would have had a response for Mr. Jefferson, because I think she would have thought Franklin was a dabbler, since he did not address himself solely to science, since he messed in politics, which she just didn't give any time to. She did at one point let a friend of hers, who was another woman and a scientist in England, put her name on a petition to get some suffragists released. They were in prison in a hunger strike. But she stayed away from feminism, and she was asked a lot to lend her name to causes. And she didn't unless it had to do with science. So I did admire her. I think she was very concerned about her reputation. So she probably would have stuck to her contention that she was the first internationally famous scientist, in the sense that you'd think of her being a household name. She was a popular figure and widely known. She would not have told you, because she was an immensely private woman, that in 1911, when she got that second Nobel Prize, there is some speculation that that was sort of a pity prize. She got that essentially for the same work for which she had already received that first Nobel Prize in physics, but that had been a very tough year for her. She had been embroiled in a scandal. She was accused of having an affair with another scientist who was married. And this was dragged through the papers. She hated journalists for this reason, ruined her life. At the end of the year, she had a nervous breakdown. Not something she would ever have told anyone publicly, so I didn't make it part of the persona. That's one of the things, by the way, I was with some of us, we got to take a training earlier in the year with Mr. Jefferson here, and that's a hard thing to do. There are things you should know about the character that we can't say as the character, because Marie Curie preferred to be called Madame Curie. She would not have gotten personal at all. That's something that belongs to our time and not to hers. So it's nice to break character.
Yes. Mr. Jefferson, do you have any closing points to make?
Just one, may your revolutions be as peaceful as possible.
I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I understand that we have some refreshments outside the door as you leave. And please join me, I'm sorry? Down the hallway. And please join me in showing our gratitude to all of our panel members here for their fine work. Nice job, very intense.